Call to order the Lake Mills Plan Commission of September 25th, 2018 at 7 p.m. And could I have a roll call, please?
Mr. Foster?
Here.
Mr. Holman?
Here.
Mr. Schumacher?
Here.
Mr. Magnuson?
Here.
Mr. Pearson?
Here.
Mr. Coots?
Here. Okay. Correction and/or approval of the minutes of August 28th, 2018. Do we have any corrections?
Move to accept. Support.
You're seconding?
Yeah, second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Could we, any other discussion? Okay. Could we have a roll call vote on that, please?
Mr. Holman?
Aye.
Mr. Schumacher?
Aye.
Mr. Magnuson?
Aye.
Mr. Pearson?
Aye.
Mr. Coots?
Aye.
Mr. Foster?
Aye.
Motion passed 6-0.
Okay, item 4, questions and public comment. Don't see a lot of public here, so you're here for the public hearing? Yeah, okay. We'll move to item 5 then, public hearing, a conditional use request. And could I have the clerk read that notice of public hearing? Is that be okay?
You want me to read the
Yes.
entire notice?
Yeah.
One
Got
moment.
it handy?
Please take notice that a conditional use request has been received from Douglas and Barbara
Use the
Mulay.
mic, please.
Please take notice that a conditional use request has been received from Douglas and Barbara Mulay for the purpose of replacing the current 3-car garage with a new 3-car garage guest house at 731 South Ferry Drive. A map of the property can be viewed at the city clerk's office, and the Plan Commission will receive public comment at a meeting to be held tonight at 7 p.m. Excuse me.
Thank you. Okay, item 6, discussion, recommendation for the noticed conditional use request. We start with staff, planner.
Let's back up a minute. Did you close the public hearing?
Did
Or
I-
are we in a public hearing now?
Oh, okay. We'll convene the public hearing then.
Okay.
This time.
You want to do a brief overlay?
Brief?
Yeah. This is the public hearing part, so I don't,
So the petitioner is requesting a conditional use for a guest house. He has a current 3-car garage. He will be tearing that down and adding the guest house to replace the footprint of the 3-car garage, but adding basically a second story, which is a residence portion. Guest houses are considered accessory structures. They're actually, this conditional use is regulated by 3 different sections of the code, one for guest houses, one for accessory structures, and then a separate one which talks about siting and design specifically of guest houses. In short, in reviewing this, there was a conflict in the code discovered, which means this application really cannot be approved. We can get into that in discussion in terms of by what I mean cannot be approved is there's conflict in the bulk requirements, meaning the square footages of the guest house in addition to the other accessory structure on the site. As a conditional use, the guest house is conditional under the R16 zoning, LRO overlay. The overlay really doesn't have a lot to do with this now, but as in terms of R16 zoning, the guest house is conditional approval. Really, we don't see any issues with the use itself. It's the bulk requirements that are causing the problem here. Staff is recommending that the Plan Commission recommends staff to make changes to the code, basically to get rid of this conflict. It should be noted this conflict has never come up in the 5 years that the code has been valid. It was approved in 2014, I believe, or 4 years. So this conflict has never occurred as far as we know. We can get into the details of that in a couple minutes.
Can you be more specific on the bulk requirements, what the staff would change?
The actual change, we don't know at this point. We need to evaluate that. I guess based on what we do know about kind of the options to keep this proposal moving forward, that's the one we're leaning towards, is we think that'll help appease the petitioner, but it'll also potentially resolve this conflict for other petitioners longer term, while keeping this sort of moving forward. The other option is really going to Zoning Board of Appeals. We don't necessarily know if what they say, if they grant a variance, we'll have to come back here anyway. We don't know if that'll necessarily solve this issue. So we're sort of, this is the approach I think we think is best to move forward with.
So we have to resolve the conflict, right? No matter what. We are going to look at it and make a recommendation how to resolve it. Hopefully that resolves Mr. Mulay's problem. Based on our conversation with you tonight, we will have a pretty good idea of how we're going to resolve that. If it doesn't help Mr. Mulay, we are going to recommend he go to the Zoning Board of Appeals. If you do take it, and what we're looking at is the process, what I'm looking at is the process, we could come back at your next meeting, have the ordinance ready to go. You could approve it. The council could have it before them at their first meeting in November. If he has to go to the Zoning Board of Appeals, we have to get out a notice. They have to hold a public hearing. They have to schedule a meeting, so they're probably out a minimum of 3 to 4 weeks. And then if they approve it, if they approve the variances, then it comes back to the Plan Commission for the conditional use review anyways. So you're probably looking at it in the November, at the earliest, the November Plan Commission meeting, because we also have to again publish a notice in the paper that we're holding a public hearing on the conditional use permit. And then it might get to the council in December. So his shortest option is, and he has some timeline issues that he would like to keep moving forward with. I think that if we can come to some satisfactory resolution in the bulk numbers, it would be faster for him just to have you approve the ordinance change at your next meeting, have you conditionally approve the conditional use permit at the next meeting, and then the council can review both of those. They can waive second and third readings and actually approve the ordinance at that time, and then approve the conditional use permit at that meeting. So he could theoretically have it done at the first meeting in November, which I think would be the fastest possible outline we have. If the city council decides they want to go through 3 readings, you'd still be pretty close to the same timeline as you would if you went through the Zoning Board of Appeals. But he has a contractor who he would like to get in and start working as soon as possible, and it's tied to some other work on his house that needs to be done, and I'm sure he can speak to that as soon as he's done. But what I reviewed was okay, we have an issue here, we need to correct it. What are his best options to get before the council and see if they're going to approve what he needs? And so if you guys are willing to work with that, then we would recommend to him that he follow the ordinance recommended change tonight, comes before you next meeting, and then if you approve it, it goes to the city council at the next meeting, where we'd recommend they waive the 3 readings and then approve the ordinance and the conditional use permit. Otherwise, his shortest option is probably to go to Zoning Board of Appeals. So at the end of this meeting, we're going to sit down with him and say, hey, these are your options.
So the biggest, sorry, the biggest issue is that it's both an accessory structure and a guest house, and we don't have anything that stipulates that in there. So if he built just a guest house, that wouldn't count against the bulk requirements for accessory structures and vice versa. Is that?
No, it would still.
The conflict exists kind of no matter if this is his property and he's building guest house or an accessory structure. The issue is that the maximum allowable square footage for accessory structures, you can have any number of accessory structures, the maximum allowable square footage is 1,000 square feet.
So even though you make different differentiation in here, a guest house, you're still considering an accessory structure?
Yes.
Okay. Got it,
Anything that isn't the principal unit is an accessory structure.
got it.
I guess
Even if it's a guest house.
from my experience with the state's changes and the rules for the Board of Zoning Appeals, I think it's better to go this route, because to prove a hardship these days isn't like an act of God. So I think it's much better to work with staff to change the code versus dragging it out through the Board of Appeals.
Yeah, and do we have to wait till the next item to understand what your recommendations are, or can?
Yeah, I would prefer to wait.
Okay.
We've gone into it quite in depth. I'd like Mr. Mulay to be able to say that he's in favor of this conditional use permit at this point in time. And then he can give any other information he wants to give, and then we'll close the public hearing, and then we can actually sit down and have a discussion on which way we want to head.
Did I understand correctly that the square footage wasn't going to increase in the footprint?
Yes.
It would be the same footprint as what's there now?
Yes.
Okay.
Which is a non-conforming condition.
All right, by putting into, we went through this years ago, when we called them granny pads at that time.
Actually, we have an accessory residential unit, which is called a nanny unit, and then this is called a guest house. They're a little bit different, but yes. But when you're looking at this, the break in the code is that the accessory unit can only be a maximum of 1,000 square feet, but the minimum size on the guest house is 1,200.
Okay.
So-
So we have that space in between there.
Yeah,
That's the
we have
problem.
200 feet of screw up.
Okay. Is there, I drove past there a couple times. At first, I was wondering where they were going to put this thing, but I didn't understand. We're going to tear the other garage down first. They would have to put sewer and water and the whole 9 yards in there, I would assume.
It's in the plan.
Yeah, I'm assuming that if they have any residential activity in there, they're gonna have
Okay.
a bathroom and stuff.
Would that be an expense to the city, or would that be on the property owner?
That's on the property owner.
Property owner, so it'd be no expense to the city.
No,
Okay.
no, there's no expense here to the city.
Any other questions for the staff? Mr. Mulay, would you care to address the commission?
Yes, and not knowing what the recommendation is going to be.
Could
Why don't you go up to the mic there?
Mike and,
Is there a sign-in sheet there?
yes.
Yeah.
Then if you could state your name and address, that would
Yes, I
help
will.
us.
My name is Douglas Mulay. My address is 731 South Ferry Drive in Lake Mills. First of all, I do want to thank, I will, off the record or on the record, Greg and Troy is who I first came to and said, okay, this is my thoughts. I don't want to stumble over myself, so I want to do it the right way. So they've been extremely helpful. The request was for conditional use for a guest house. I submitted the city code to my architect. When he originally sent me the drawing, it was 1,200 plus square feet. We did not consider it to be a accessory structure simply because in the code, it states in the code, no accessory building or structure may be used for living quarters. So we did not, in looking at it, we read it that way, saying, okay, accessory structures are storage units, garages, but a guest property can't be included. That's got a new standard of 1,200 square feet. It's in section general under 6, that's where it states no accessory building or structure may be used for living quarters. So we did not assume it to be part at all of an accessory structure. Anyways, when we came in and met, there was still some concerns that it was to be 1,000 square feet maximum. At that time, it was very difficult to take this building and get the same amount of use down to 1,000 square feet, but I have a very clever architect and he did it. Very limited in rooms. Then when I got the report, and by the way, I thought the report was outstanding, it started talking about 1,000 total with the storage or shed that we have by the water. It's not a boathouse, it's a storage unit. So we said, if we have to downsize this anymore, it gets past the ability to even get it done. The cost versus the use and things like that. So my suggestion tonight, and I don't know what your suggestion is going to be, was put it back at 1,200 and simply submit it as at least 1,200 square feet, and submit it under the terms of the code currently, which would be a conditional use. You have to satisfy all the bulk area, all the conditional use standards of square footage, usage, land usage, greenway, all of that will be met, but just resubmit it under the guest house side of the code and not under the bulk, or I'm sorry, the accessory building structure, because that shouldn't be counted because it's not a living place. So I'm still confused because there's multiple places that indicate conflict here.
Well, you can build an accessory building without a conditional use permit.
Right.
So what it's saying is you cannot have an accessory use by permit that is a residential unit.
Correct.
So if you're moving to a residential type unit that's that's separate from your main residential unit, it is still an accessory use, but it is a residential use. So what it's saying is any of those uses that you have, you can't convert to residential unless you get the conditional use permit. So it's still part of the
Agreed.
total bulk requirement.
That I totally agree with.
So
Absolutely.
when we look at it, we don't want to separate those.
Okay.
What we want to do is figure out how to resolve the conflict between the two
And I
sizes.
agree. And all I'm asking this committee, it was very difficult to even get it to the size I got it to. If there was any way we could, for the lack of come up with some number that works somewhere between there or at the 1,200 level, it would help. And it's been drawn both ways. I've had architects do it both ways, because originally they did it at the 1,200 level or bigger.
There are options, and we'll discuss that when we get
Okay.
into the other part
And
of the
that's,
meeting.
I'm assuming that, but at this point, like I say, I will commit to the city. It will be built at my expense. There is no burden to you. It'll be an outstanding appearance. My neighbors on both sides are my dear friends. The whole reason we decided to do it as a guest house, because the main structure was built on a 100-year-old foundation, and we can't disturb it, as well as we're pretty well landlocked to build anything else. And my family is growing in leaps and bounds as my 7th grandchild is on the way, or 6th grandchild is on the way, so. All right. And so I just, wait to see what your recommendations are, and we'll go from there. I would prefer at least keeping the process moving forward rather than to get into variations, because, like I say, the code does say 1,200, so I'm kind of conflicted. I'm actually in violation per the report because I'm too small against the 1,200 square foot. All right.
Thank you. I take it we're not going to have any other further public input. So I'll close the public hearing and I'll go to item 6, discussion recommendation, conditional use request. So staff, I think we've heard your...
Anything else you want to go over on the memo?
Take a quick look. I guess I would like to point out, at this point, the proposal that we've gotten in terms of placement on the existing foundation, staff is happy with that. I think it's a really good solution to the,
It's not going to be on the existing foundation. I have to move that because it won't support.
in the existing location, excuse me, yep. In the existing location, we feel that's a good solution by basically putting the footprint back where it is. He does have an existing driveway that approaches on the north, so he's basically tying back into that, not creating another land disturbance. He does have landscaping along the east edge, again, tying into that, not creating another disturbance. Mature trees that'll remain, at least we believe that they will remain. So by putting the building back where it is, Staff is very happy with that. So the solution that he's come up with to date to come down from 1,200 to 988, staff feels is a good one. The other point I would make is the appearance of the structure complements the house and the architecture of the house. So again, in that regard, staff is happy with the architecture. There is another non-conforming issue, that being that this as an accessory structure is technically not allowed to be in front of a principal structure. However, you know, the hardship of the lake and the placement of the building on the lot, you can't really put anything behind the house. I didn't see anything in code to say that the lake is considered the front yard and the street side is considered the rear. That might be up for kind of conversation, but obviously this house and the other properties on there have been in this condition, and really kind of the only condition it can be in for 100 years. So I just point that out. Talk briefly about the conditional use. I mentioned the use itself, staff doesn't really have an issue with. The comprehensive plan does not make specific mention or recommendation for guest houses. However, the plan states goals and policies of the city are to allow for the redevelopment of residential property in a manner that respects the context of the established neighborhoods. I think Mr. Mulay pretty much nails that on the head. And then the plan states provide for a range of housing types and densities while maintaining an emphasis on single-family homes. Again, I think he pretty much nails that on the head. So this application of a guest house as a use, I think, is a good one in this case. Again, we just get into that conflict of the code in terms of square footage requirements.
So assuming that this is withdrawn and we go through the process of changing the actual code, do we already have something in mind that we want to go to of reducing either one or increasing the other?
Well, we've had discussions on how we would do it. There are a couple different ways. And I assume that if you give us the direction, we'll work through that. I think what we were looking at was maybe 1,100 and 1,100. Most codes have 10,000 square foot as the accessory use number, or 1,000 feet. So we would be a little bit unusual. As is typical, you're going to have a million people come in and say, well, I was held to the 1,000 square foot and now it's 1,100. So I always have people telling me, well, everybody else did it that way. Why can't I? That's old. But from that standpoint, it might work the best. It gives him a little bit more room to get the residential structure in there. And like he said, getting a nice residential guest house in 1,000 square feet is pretty tough. So I believe that would be one of the options. Another one would be defining the guest house separately as not necessarily an accessory use. I don't know, that doesn't work very well. Just because when you're reading the code and you're looking at accessory uses, there's another one where you could look at it and say the overall number of accessory uses can be greater. Each accessory use could be up to 1,000 square feet to the total of the green space coverage that's required on a lot. That's the old way we used to define it until the new code was written in 14. So there are several ways we could look at that and make some recommendations on how it is. I think the simplest one is just to go to 1,100 on both of them.
You know, the lake, we did the overlay zoning. because the lake does present some unique situations. So would you do it under the umbrella of the overlay district then?
Yes, it would be an overlay district specialty. The, particularly with relationship, we might do some work on, there are a large number of garages that are actually in the front yard on the lake.
That's what I was going to say.
So
It's
we-
very similar to what currently exists. along the
Right,
lake.
there's, and so that might be the time to look at that and say, hey, in the overlay district, having a, a lot of people are trying to define their house, the front of their house as the lakeside.
Yeah,
And in this case, I think that we would want the garage to be, accessible to the roadway, and you don't want it set in front of in the back of the house where you have to, where the lake view is looked over a garage. So it's a little bit unique in that way, so we would definitely look at how we would do some of these in the lake overlay district.
At some point in time, I'm gonna go back and, as a plan commission agenda item, I've been too busy, Pam's been after me, but we're gonna address that garage thing in front of the house. And I don't know if it'll be an overlay district, but there are some houses, and I talked to the two property owners in particular that, these houses were built 50 years ago. And I'm all for keeping our existing front setback of 25 feet, but I don't think a house that was built pre-code, I think it's unfair to limit them to have a garage in front of the house. So somewhere along the line, I'm gonna bring this to the plan commission. We're gonna address that because we had it in the code, and then I wasn't at the city council meeting, and the ruling got construed on what the intent was of the zoning ordinance, and I wasn't there to defend it. So I want to bring it back up at Plan Commission and then resubmit hopefully an approval to City Council that addresses this issue, whether it be houses built before 2000 or something. I don't know how exactly. I mean, we'll discuss it at that meeting, but we are going to address this at a different meeting, not just on the lake overlay.
So I've been sitting here just running some different options through my head. And, you'd mentioned 11 and 11, 11 for a guest house and 11 for accessory.
That's
That
the easiest.
That covers each of them independently. What if we added a third category? The mix like he's asking for, garage / guest house, and put that at 1,200. I'm just throwing it out there. See what comments come out.
It creates more conflicts in the accessory use bulk requirements. You can't, whenever somebody looks at something that's not the principal unit, it's an accessory use. So now you're totaling the square footage to get to that point. And so accepting it creates a problem for most people when you're going to have a unique code and you're going to come in and people, it's not going to be the standard that you're going to look at and say, hey, that's what happens when you have a type of thing. You're going to have a real interpretation problem in the long run. You want to make something that's consistent in both your accessory use and any of the other uses that come into it. So, from my opinion, when you're trying to read a code and you're looking at it and you're going, I know that people try and make the exception, but if I was the planner and I was going to someone's site and reading it and I was looking at those items, I would say, okay, I know that this is the principal unit. Anything outside the principal unit is an accessory unit. Why is the guest house an exception? And so you want to...
It already is when we have the limit that it has to be 1,200 square foot or bigger as a guest house. And
But
then
that was a mistake in the bulk requirements.
Right, and you're still calling it a guest house and not an accessory building.
No, the guest house is a conditional use permit. It's still an accessory use.
So you're talking about taking a current thing that we have in there and actually making it smaller, and then
Making
by
the other one bigger.
doing that, making the other one bigger.
You can't, right now, you can't build a guest house. Literally, you cannot build a guest house.
Okay,
So if you were looking at it and you were saying, you're restricting the guest house, no, you're not, because you can't build it.
so
We
why,
just had that conversation tonight. He can't build a 1,200 square foot guest house because of the bulk requirements of accessory use.
gotcha, no, yeah. You confused us a little there because you're saying you can't build one, but you actually could if the codes were right.
That's right.
That's-
That's what we're asking you to do is
I know.
put the codes
I'm just,
together
I'm
so
just,
that we.
I'm trying to look at all the options that we have out there, and how does his current accessory building then play into that? Because if we went to 1,100, and he already has a 100 square foot building out there, then that would drop him down, back down to the 1,000.
He'd still technically be over by 2 square feet
Right,
in that exact scenario. All
Right.
else, staying the same. Like, to your point, I think one of the other options would be if currently the code allows for any number of accessory structures on a lot totaling 1,000 square feet. I think that potential language could be changed, that language could potentially be changed. That's, again, staff discussion in terms of if there is a guest house that must be 1,200, then the accessory structure, 1,000 square feet, can go up to, say, 1,300, so that you could still have a 100 square foot shed along with a 1,200 square foot guest house. I think that's kind of maybe one exception that you could slide in. So that's another option to kind of, talking about, I think how you started that question is, could
Right.
you have both and still, so.
yeah, because right there, that would probably eliminate all issues for everybody right then. We would have clear and concise language, and he would be able to build the size of structure, accessory structure that he would like.
Yep, we just have to, you like to say yes, but obviously we have to check it against all the other stuff that it may
I gotcha.
affect in the code, so yeah. Yeah.
I got you.
Could you repeat that question? I'm sorry. The question that you just asked him, I didn't hear it.
Oh, well, you can explain what
So-
you said as a result from it.
The thought was that with the accessory structures being 1,000 square feet, could you make the exception that when one of the accessory structures is a guest house, that 1,000 square feet goes up to, say, 1,300 square feet, so that you're allowed to have that 1,200 square foot guest house plus a 100 square foot or
Create-
250 square feet or whatever it is?
Creating an exception in the existing code that affords for 1,200 square foot guest house
Right.
in accordance with the code seems to make
For
sense
the
to me.
lake overlay.
Right.
So, yeah.
I think there's a few points here to debate, and there's a number of ways to kind of address this issue. My initial concern here is the idea of aggregate. So under 10.2.1B5, number of accessory structures on an individual lot, it states that there is no limit to the number of accessory structures that you can have on a lot. And then the next sentence is that, except that the aggregate square footage of the accessory structure shall not exceed the regulations outlined in 3 above. 3 above doesn't speak to aggregate numbers whatsoever. 3 above specifically states that no single accessory structure may be above 1,000 square foot. So I think there's a little bit of a jump there, that you're assuming that 5 does apply to 3, because I personally don't think it's clear. And then the other thing that you have to do here is basically somehow jive that guest house as an accessory structure either are or not either are or not afforded 1,200 square feet, as it states in the code. So those are the issues that have to be jived in my mind.
The, the person who wrote the code, which is where the legal terms will go to the intent, says that the 1,000 square foot is the aggregate. So if you're going to end up in court and argue that point, the court is going to look to the person who wrote the code and his intent. And if he says, Dustin says it's 1,000 square feet, and you want to do it another way, that's what I mentioned. The old way we used to do it was that way. And so if you want to go to that, but it still doesn't accomplish the unit because no single structure can be bigger than 1,000 square feet. And so he's still not big enough. The real question is how to get to that 1,200 square foot. And so if you're willing to do that, then the suggestion here might be the easiest.
Could we add one more thing to the fire here? Could
Let's
we
burn the
keep
whole thing
that
down.
when we're going through on the code changes, or perhaps trying to combine this? If you have a guest house, that's different than a permanent residence,
Yes.
okay? So could we have that involved in there as far as the size is concerned? As a temporary guest house can be X amount, but if it's a permanent residence, it can't be done. I'm just throwing that up just to muddy the water a little here.
The permanent residence, you can build it as big as you want on the lot, as long as you don't hit your coverage.
But you gotta have
requirements.
so much lot to have so many people,
Right,
okay?
the coverage and the densities are probably in it, but a guest house is a little bit different. The
'Cause we have several of these in town now,
guest houses,
yes. There's one on the end of Ferry Drive, and there's one on Main Street. We
Yeah.
called them granny pads 20, 15 years ago, and we went through this before.
yeah, no, those are under a different code requirement again, Ken. That's an accessory residential unit.
They're above a garage.
Yeah, but they're structured in a different form than the guest house. Because generally, in those conditions, they were constructed with the intent of it being for a rental unit, or for you to have your grandmother live, or your mother live with you, or
Yep,
something
yep.
along that line. And so they're not necessarily a guest house where you see the changeover in the people who are
Right,
there.
they were
It's
permanent
generally a
residents, because it
long-term-
was a family member that moved into them.
Right, so,
Normally, and I think both of them were for elderly family members to
Right,
be
so-
watched
so-
over.
so the condition there is a different section of the code. That's an accessory residential unit, which we did look at to see if that would work. And then we pulled down to the guest house because it is actually a different condition. But yeah, those are different, and obviously they're grandfathered. Yeah, so anytime we change a code, so anything that was built, there were no guest house built from
Because the
14th
one
of
is small
18.
and the one is quite spacious, is what I'm saying. The Main Street is quite spacious, and the one down on Ferry Drive is just above a little two-car garage.
Yeah, and those are built under different code conditions, so
Right.
it's hard for us to sit back and say, what we have to deal with is the code that we're looking at now, and say, okay, what do we want to see this look like? Now, we've already discussed the fact that it looks great. So from the standpoint of construction style and everything, we think it's a great use. What are you comfortable with in the square footage? And do you feel comfortable with carving in an exception for guest house? If you do, then we'll probably sit down and hammer that out. We might come back and have two proposals, because as we sit down and work through this, we might come up with some other ideas. I mean, it wasn't like I was getting ready I wasn't planning on being here tonight, so I didn't really read it very close until Doug called me. And then we had a lot of quick conversations. But as we sit down and work through this, I think we'll work for that type of exception that's discussed, and then when we come back, we'll have at least one option, if not more. We can discuss that and then push it through. We'll let him know what the conditions are that are in that, and then he can come back with a slightly modified conditional use permit to whatever square footage we hit, like 1,200 if we go to that.
Yeah.
Then
I would recommend that.
I like the idea of multiple plans, and then we got something to look at, and probably not adding them together. Not counting, if they got a little tool shed, not counting that into a separate structure in the total. That's just silly.
Well, it gets hard to start separating what
Yeah.
is and what isn't an
Yeah.
accessory
Right.
unit. It's just easier to add them all up. Because, you know, now we gotta go in and define what an accessory unit is. So if someone's telling us what this unit is, and we're saying, well, no, that's not what you're using it for, but he
Yeah.
says, that's what I'm using it for.
That gets sticky.
And so then we're gonna end up in court arguing what he's using that accessory unit for. Let's just have all accessory units that aren't the principal residential unit, and if you wanna add more square footage to it, add more square footage to it.
Yeah,
But-
and I would make the recommendation,
Adam-
we start at the 1,200
Total?
Go for a guest house.
for the,
Oh, just for the
this
guest
specific
house. Yeah,
case,
yeah,
for the
yeah.
overlay.
Yeah.
Well, that's what you're saying.
And have you guys work with that?
Yeah,
and See
we-
what you can,
We do something like 1,300 or,
yeah, whatever,
yeah. Then they
Yeah.
could have some other accessory unit besides the guest house.
yeah. And they'd be able to come back to us with some recommendations then for that.
Speaking of the original code, was there a rationale behind the 1,000, or was it just a nice round number? The original aggregate total limitation.
Historically, it looked at the size of existing garages.
Oh,
And so, you know, what you were looking at was, originally, there were a lot of single-family garages. So our original code at one point was like 550 square foot accessory uses. And then it went to, and as garages got bigger and bigger and bigger, and then they started adding other accessory uses on the site, we expanded to 1,000 square feet. And we did that, I was here when we went to 1,000 square feet. So that's less than 18, less than 18 years ago. For a long time, it was 550 square feet. So looking at it and how accessory units attached to a residential unit have changed over the years is kind of what we try and evaluate. Saying, okay, is this typical, is this not? What we try not to end up with is a lot of accessory units on a site that are really big, that allow for businesses to move in without us knowing about it. Because these are residential zones, they're not business zones. And a lot of times what we find is you get a large accessory unit and pretty soon someone's running a business out of it. And it's really hard to get them out. And then you end up with a lot of hostile neighbors,
not that,
and the city really isn't crazy about trying to boot somebody out, and you gotta go through all the legal processes. It's just not a fun process. So if you were looking at it from the beginning and saying, okay, if we don't allow them to get these huge structures in, so that's what we do. We kind of go through and planners, they do this weird stuff. They evaluate the structures on a site, and they get all this data from all the other cities, and they kind of look at it and say, this is pretty typical now of what it's like to have a couple accessory, an accessory use and then a garage.
So the recommendation would be that they would work with like a 1,300 overall, and then be able to allow him to build something 1,200 that's a garage and a guest house. Those are the parameters they were gonna work with, so.
Is that what you're saying? Or would you like to evaluate and then come back with a number?
I think as long as you allow some flexibility, we'll use that one, but if we find something we think will work better, then we'll go that route. But we'll bring both of them back for you to evaluate. I think the goal is to make sure that he can hit the 1,200-foot guest house.
I was reading through this, it's interesting that they say any number of structures. What does that mean for accessory? You could have 5 200s?
Yes, that's what it means.
Is that logical?
No. But what you see is sometimes you'll see 2 550s. Someone will have an old garage that they had
Yeah,
there.
that's fine, but
And then they add another 500, or they might have instead of doing like the little pull-in shed that's not attached, that doesn't count, they'll build an actual shed on a foundation, that counts, and then that's an accessory use along with the garage. So you have to look at, you could have 2, 3 accessory structures on a site, especially real large lots. That's not unusual to hit.
Boathouse, shed, garage.
Yeah, in this case, you got a boathouse and you could have a shed and a garage.
Well, this will take them up to the limit probably.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
we try and look at it and be relatively flexible, but like I said, we're trying to control several different items here to protect the residential use of a property.
Another question on guest houses shall not be rented or leased. How does that fit into the Airbnb era?
That's really the use part of this conditional use. The other.
This would override that then?
Well, the other
Airbnb?
condition on this approval originally was that the guest house not be rented or leased. That was the general, and we understand from the petitioner it's going to be used for family use. I mean, we take his word at this point. Obviously, that's something for the
But there is
inspector
state
to
precedent now, I guess.
inspect.
But he could rent the house out.
Yeah, there's nothing to stop.
Yeah, there's nothing that we can do to stop him from renting the
We
house out.
could stop
as
them
a-
from renting out them?
You could, the guest house, we could stop him, but the house, we could not.
Okay, I was just curious. I realize that, but you might not be the continual owner of the, we're looking forward.
Yeah, it's funny, we can put a conditional use on the guest house to control it, but the actual house state statute says we can't.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Well, as long as the front setback on that garage is fine, and the south setback on that garage is fine, and of course the north is, got the driveway and else in front of it, they get 200 more square feet, he can go towards the house, because there's plenty of room between that garage and that house. I see no reason why we can't work that out. That 1,300 square foot rule that you're talking about sounds like a reasonable answer to this thing. Because we went through with people parking their nice fancy trailers alongside the house and people moving into them. You know, we went through all that business, that's all in that code. But I don't know, I'm a little prejudiced against lake lots because I think they're gorgeous and they pay a lot of taxes. And if the guy wants to put up a guest house and a lot is big enough for it and we can work it out, I think we should do it.
Well, I look at it this way. You have a lake lot and you have a lot of advantages and the taxes you paid don't buy you any special privileges.
Yep.
Everybody else pays taxes based on what they own and their ability to pay, and everybody, and once it comes to us, everybody's equal. So just because you pay a lot of taxes, you're not gonna get any special benefit from me from the person who's living out in the trailer.
No, but I mean, if the lot is big enough to accept it, it just adds to the tax base.
Yeah, but when you start cluttering up a unit, then at what point does it start losing value? And then the other lake houses start looking at it and going, hey, there's a problem here. At some point in time, as you live in a city, there's an understanding that there's a neighborhood, and the neighborhood has to be able to live together, and there's certain standards that you want to see. And that's why you buy into that neighborhood. If you want to live in a different type of situation, you could go to another area and have all the freedom you want to do whatever you want. But when you're in a tight neighborhood on small lots along the lake, and you're looking at the gigantic houses they're building on these things and all the other things that they're trying to cram in, you want to make sure that you have a certain amount of control over how much they can build there and what it is. And so from that standpoint, it's, we try and look at it and say, okay, it's nice that you as an individual want to have all this, but you also have to fit into the neighborhood. There's a certain amount of give and freedom. There's a certain amount of free right, and then there's a certain amount of I have to live with my neighbors, and we all have to agree on something. And so this is kind of where we're at. We run this. You were here. We put this out. We brought in lake people. We brought in all the neighbors. We pumped this. We read this document at every meeting for 2 years.
Yep.
We debated it coming and going. So You know, if they had any problem with the way it was laid out, they should have been in. But as, from what I saw, most of them wanted it more restrictive, not less restrictive. And so from that standpoint, I think that we cut a pretty good cloth here with
Okay.
making what we did.
Thank
Well
you.
put. I think we got a consensus here, huh? Do we, have staff come up with some proposals and
Sure.
with the planner? And do you need that in the form of a motion,
Do
or?
we have to move to withdraw the
Just
motion?
table it.
Just table it?
Yeah, I was going to say, I would make a motion to table this until our next meeting, when hopefully we can have recommendations from staff for code changes.
There you go, you got a second?
I'll second.
Any other discussion? Okay, I'll call for a roll call vote, please.
Mr. Schumacher?
Aye.
Mr. Magnuson?
Aye.
Mr. Pearson?
Okay,
Mr. Coots?
Aye.
Mr. Foster?
Aye.
Mr. Holman?
Aye.
Motion passed 6-0.
Okay, that takes care of number 6. Number 7, recommendations for future agendas. Anybody?
I'm pretty sure we'll have an ordinance amendment and a conditional use permit.
Yeah, for the next meeting.
just,
I'd bet on that.
just to have it, old man, have it clear. We just tabled this situation, and you're gonna come back with some recommendations as to how to change the zone to get this thing done. Thank you.
An actual change to the ordinances, yes.
Yep, okay. And then we have to approve that first, I would assume.
You make a recommendation to the council has to approve the ordinance change.
Okay,
I don't like to put it that way though, Kenny. I like to put it in a form that says, we're gonna try and accommodate him within the scope of what's good for the city.
Well put.
Yep.
Anybody care to make a motion for adjournment?
So moved.
Second?
Support.
We have a second. I'll have a motion second. Would you have a little roll call vote?
Mr. Magnuson?
Aye.
Mr. Pearson?
aye.
Mr. Coots?
Aye.
Mr. Foster?
Aye.
Mr. Holman?
Aye.
Mr. Schumacher?
Aye.
Motion passed 6-0.
We're adjourned.